woke up suddenly, sat straight up in bed. He was sweating all over. His wife said, "What's wrong? You look terrified." He said, "Well, I dreamed I died." She looked at him and said, "I'm so sorry, honey. It must have been awful." He said, "It was." He goes, I died, and then suddenly I'm standing at the door of heaven, and God is sitting there on the throne, and he, all of a sudden, he sneezed, and I didn't know what to say." You bless you. Yeah. My grandfather would have loved that joke. My grandfather had a deep and a gritty laugh that I loved. He found great joy in laughing, and my grandfather was a big advocate of humor and having a sense of humor. He loved humor so much that he actually wrote a book called How to Be Funny on Purpose. My grandfather has been on my mind a lot lately. He passed away at 100 years old a couple of weeks ago. But even today, as Grandpa listens in on our service, I know that he enjoys a good laugh. He would also find it humorous that as children, we like to add to our ages. We're not 4, we're 4.5, or 4 3/4, or 5. We always add. You wouldn't do that when you're 100 years old, but just to make it clear, my grandfather was 100.5 before he died. I think my grandfather would also appreciate the story of a young man who applied to a religious college for his theological education. And if he was going to be a minister, this was going to be the place to learn about what it meant to lead a congregation. The application process involved meeting the dean of students. So the young man was ushered into this room, and the room was all draped in black. And there was a single candle on the table. So the room's completely black, and he's sitting there. And as I have told of this before, he looked around the room and didn't see anybody, and all of a sudden a man walked in. Again, robes all in black. And the man sat down across from him and said, "Are you prepared to die?" The man looked at him absolutely shocked. He said, "What?" He said, "Are you prepared to die?" Instantly, the student jumped up, ran out, and into the light, never to return. The young man thought that he was there to be examined on his skills, but instead was asked a question that I think a lot of Christians spend their life doing, thinking about being prepared to die. Well, I want to live my life like my grandfather. I want to live a life knowing that I'm already prepared to die. That part I don't need to worry about. When I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, the preparing to die part, that's all over. Instead, I want to live like my grandfather lived, focused on preparing to live life. My grandfather lived and lived well for over 100 years. He didn't spend his time preparing for death. My grandfather was still writing books in the last years of his life. My grandfather was still participating in family activities. He was still actively engaged in politics and religion, pop culture and sports. My grandfather did not give up on living out what God called him to do. It doesn't mean that there wasn't heartache in his life. Everyone here knows that sometimes life just stinks. You can be the greatest person anyone has ever met and still have heartache in your life. In my case, or in Grandpa's case, he lost his life's true love when my grandmother died in what I believe was hospital incompetence. And yet, Grandpa continued to live life. It doesn't matter if it's emotional, if it's physical, if it's spiritual. Each of us will experience pain, grief, and sorrow in our lives. Some may be experiencing it right now, but there is a knowledge and wisdom I find in the Bible that gives me peace and understanding. It begins with who we are to God. I'm going to be focused specifically on the 8th chapter of Romans this morning, beginning in verse 15. And Paul's explaining himself to the Roman church about what it means to live a life in the Spirit. The Spirit you received does not make you slaves so that you live in fear again. Rather, the Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. And by Him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Who are we to God? Some may think that when we surrender to God, we suddenly become slaves. Suddenly that our lives are governed in fear. That we always have to be worried that we're going to stumble and make a mistake and that God's going to strike us down, lightning bolt out of the blue, if we do anything that is against what God has called us to do. But Paul has changed this whole picture in how he describes what it means to be someone who is with God. This is fascinating because it says so much about who we are in God's eyes. We are not slaves. We are God's adopted children. God is our Father and we are His family. It's an entirely different picture than when we think of it that way, when we are described as children. But it's also interesting that God uses the idea of adoption into the family. In Roman society, an adoption was considered to be valid if there were two witnesses. And Paul says that there are two witnesses in this case. First of all, God Himself witnesses through the Holy Spirit that we have been adopted into the family of God. But there's another witness. And it's a witness that is so important. It's the witness of you and I. When we are adopted into the family, we testify to that. We talk about that. We say what it means to be a child of God. And that's why this verse, and that's what this verse means when it says, the Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Two witnesses to our adoption. Paul makes it clear that this is more than just being adopted. There are benefits to being adopted. You probably know the musical Annie. And who was Annie? She was an orphan. And who adopted her? Daddy Warbucks. There was a benefit. Now this is completely crass and thinking from a human perspective. What was the benefit to Annie of being adopted by Daddy Warbucks? It's right at the end of Daddy Warbucks' name. What was the benefit? Bucks. Yeah, suddenly she went from living poor to living rich. She had an inheritance that she had immediately. And guess what? Paul says that's what we get as well when we are adopted into the family of God. In Romans 8:17 it says, now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If we share in His sufferings in order that we may also share in His glory. This is where Paul is telling the Roman church that suffering is a part of our lives. But he's also saying that we should be hopeful and not discouraged. Why? Because we, as adopted children, we have a great benefit. We are heirs of God. But the inheritance we receive from God doesn't begin with death. The word in the Bible actually means a gift that can be given anytime. Our dinner theater this year is about the prodigal son. And if you know the story, the prodigal son went to his father and asked for his inheritance before his father was dead. He said, may I have it now? And his father gave it to him. So he had his inheritance before he was even dead. And a lot of people do that. I just heard that Zuckerberg, who started Facebook, gave away, was it something like $1 billion this last year, the most of anybody? And that would have been part of his inheritance to whoever he would give it, but he's already given it away. It's already been something that he's given now. Somebody has benefited from the inheritance now, much like we will benefit as children of God with the inheritance we receive. At the 1924 Olympic Games in Paris, there was a new sport added. It was canoe racing, of all things. And the U.S. was expected to have a great team. It was 4-man canoe racing. Team USA was expected to win the race. And there was a man named Bill Havens, and he was supposed to be on that team. However, there was a little bit of a problem. His wife was pregnant and was due during the Olympic Games. Her due date happened to fall right at the time that the U.S. team was expected to compete. So he had a big decision to make. He could go to Paris and take a chance on missing the birth, or he could withdraw from the Olympics and stay home with his family. Bill's wife told him, go to the games. This is your lifelong dream. You need to go to the games and participate. His team was expected to win the gold. So this was, not only was it a lifelong dream to compete in the Olympics, he was expected to win the gold medal. But he didn't go. He withdrew from the Olympics to stay by the side of his wife. That was his priority. That was the decision he made. Guess what? The U.S. team won gold. And then Bill's wife was late in delivering the baby. She was so late that he could have easily have gone to the Olympics, competed, and gotten home in time. Now think about this. 1924, you don't jump on an airliner and go to Paris to participate in the games. At that time, you got an ocean-going vessel. You got on a ship, basically, 2 weeks to get there, 2 weeks to get back, and he still could have gotten back in time. People said to him over and over, "What a shame. You had a chance to win the gold, and you could have done it and still been there for the berth." People said, "You could have won the gold." People wondered why he gave up his life's dream. But he didn't regret it at all. Not one time did he say that he regretted it. For the rest of his life, he believed he made the right decision. Being at the side of his wife was the highest priority, higher than any dream of gold medal, of a gold medal hanging around his neck. He had given an inheritance without even knowing it. But no one, including Bill himself, knew what that meant in 1924. They didn't know what was going to happen 28 years later. You see, there's a twist to this story. The baby did come very late, and it was a boy. They named him Frank. And almost exactly 28 years later, a cablegram arrived for Bill Havens. It was sent from Helsinki, Finland, in the summer of 1952, and it was from Bill's son, Frank. The cablegram said simply, "Dad, I won. I'm bringing home the gold medal you gave up while waiting for me to be born." Frank Havens had just won the gold medal for the United States in canoe racing. It was the medal his father had dreamed of winning, but gave up as an inheritance to his son. Frank Havens experienced an even greater joy and inheritance in this life when he won that gold medal, knowing what his father had given to him. He saw in his father the sacrifice he made and what he gave up. And the same is true of our Heavenly Father. We can experience the joy and the blessings of God's inheritance in our lives right now. We are heirs of God. The inheritance we possess is a hope for the future. That future is in God. What does God see in us? We are adopted into His family when we're in the family. We become heirs of inheritance we can already experience, which means life is going to be perfect, right? No, that's not what Paul says to the Roman church. He says, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." Paul says suffering is a part of our lives. It is something we should expect. Becoming a believer does not eliminate suffering. If anything, it sometimes can bring more. But God has given us a promise. But in order to understand the promise, we have to do some spiritual math. Instead of working out our problems from an earthly perspective, we need to see them through God's eyes. There are real hurts and pains in life. There's the hurt of sickness, of disease, physical pain. There's the hurt of losing a loved one. There's the hurt of rejection and broken relationships. There are disappointments in life. This is a part of our life, but we need to do a little spiritual math to see beyond it. In the spiritual math equation, suffering equals glory. As Paul says, what is happening here doesn't compare to the glory ahead. Spiritual math isn't as hard to understand as we may think. I don't know if you saw the USA hockey game yesterday versus Russia, but it was one of the most emotionally draining games I've ever seen. The score ended in a tie and resulted in a shootout. If you know how hockey shootouts work, it's one player against one player for one team against the goalie of the other. The goal is to score more goals, each individual going against the goalie of the opposite team until there is a winner. Well, this went on and on and on. The original three, they each have a chance at 3 shots. The U.S. scored the first, and it looked like they were going to win the whole thing, and Russia scored on their last opportunity to throw it into a second shootout. And in the second shootout, each team is allowed to have whoever they want try to get the puck into the goal. The U.S. chose the only guy who scored on the first 3. The guy's name was T.J. Oshie. That guy right there. He was given the opportunity, or the choice he didn't really have, to go out on the ice every single time, over and over and over, and kept trying to score for the U.S. Karen and I were standing in the family room watching this, literally standing, holding on, because every time that Russia would go down the ice, they were up first every time. You were hoping they'd miss so that TJ could go down the other end and score and win it, because it was sudden death. So Russia went down, they'd score, and we're like, oh no, it's all up to him now. And it was funny to watch him because he'd go down the ice so calmly while everybody else seemed to just race at the net. He would just calmly go down the ice and shoot and score. Each time Russia scored, he scored. Each time Russia missed, he missed. until the final time, when Russia went down and missed. And TJ Oshie went down the ice and scored the goal. After the game, I've seen several interviews with him, and he didn't look nervous. As I said, he went down the ice, and it seemed like he was just very nonchalantly going down the ice, and that last flick of the stick before, it went into the goal. But he said it wasn't that way at all. In fact, he said he turned around several times looking at the coach like, you want me to stay out here? The whole world is watching. The whole United States. I was watching on Facebook because everybody's like going crazy as this game continued, saying, are you seeing this? Are you seeing this? The whole weight of the world was on him. The weight of the United States was on him. Team USA, were they going to win or not, was on him. And he said, yes, I was nervous. And yes, I was suffering. And yes, I just played a whole game and I was tired. And he said, I was running out of moves. I didn't know what to do. And he looked over at the coach, and the coach didn't signal to have, in fact, he wouldn't even look at him. Didn't signal anybody else to get him. He suffered. He suffered for the gold. He suffered to win for Team USA. Just standing there watching it, I was tired. I can't imagine how he felt. We must look ahead to the glory to come. We must do our spiritual math. We will go through painful times, but one day the pain will be gone and the glory will be lasting. Now, theirs didn't last very long because they turned around and had to play again this morning. But knowing that they'd beaten the Russians is probably one of the biggest deals for the U.S. team of any, just because of the history between our teams. There's no doubt that even though we are children of God, we will face suffering, we will face trials. This is true simply because we have not experienced the fullness of what it means to be children of God. But our spiritual map helps us to understand what that means. We are adopted, we are heirs, and as a result, there will be glory. There will be glory. Our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. It doesn't mean that our troubles go away. I look at my grandfather's life and I see someone who understood spiritual math. He understood what it meant to be an adopted child of God. And he also understood what it meant that he was already a child of God and therefore he could live life and not spend his time preparing for death. For the Olympians, the glory is only for a short time, much as it was for Team USA as they had to play again this morning. The glory of standing on the podium with a gold medal is only fleeting. For us, though, glory is forever.